Thank you very much. I'd like to make 2 points. The first has to do with Arctic frost and the information, Chairman, that you released the other day. It's been described as a politically weaponized investigation, but I ask my colleagues, should there have been no investigation of the raiding and the ransacking of the United States Capitol? Of course there should have been an investigation. And by the way, I was with many of you during those dark hours, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind in the Senate at that point that crimes had been committed and that they needed to be investigated. So please, let's not pretend that the fact that the FBI investigated the raiding and the ransacking of the United States Capitol is itself in any way politically weaponized. That is their job. To the question of senators being in the list of toll record investigations, I'm eager to get to the bottom of that. I think we should get to the bottom of that. But let's remember what this was. This was toll records, which for those of us who've been prosecuting for a while is similar to a pen register, which is where in the old days the phone company would clip a register onto the wire, and you wouldn't know what was said. You would only know what number called what other number and for how long. When you have what prosecutors would call predication, to put a pen register on one number, you necessarily pick up everybody else who was called. That doesn't make them the subjects of any investigation. Similarly, if you're running a wiretap, and by the way, a pen register is not a wiretap, and senators on this committee should be knowledgeable and scrupulous enough not to confuse the two. But were this a wiretap, the same thing would take place. If, as U.S. Attorney, I got a wiretap on a Rhode Island mobster, and that mobster called the butcher, the baker, or the babysitter, the butcher, the baker, or the babysitter are now swept into the investigation by virtue of having been called. It doesn't make them the subject of any investigation. And with wiretaps, it works that you have minimization procedures, so you shut it off and so forth. But this wasn't a wiretap. This was toll records, the modern equivalent of a pen register that only shows who was called. So before we start to reach irate conclusions about weaponized FBIs going after people, it is worth taking a calming step back to consider the possibility that the FBI had proper predication for certain phones, and that those phones then called the senators. I don't know what happened, and I support the chairman's desire to investigate this. But we should investigate this without reaching dire conclusions before we have the evidence. Because there is a very clear investigative scenario in which the FBI has proper predication to get toll records, or in the old days, a pen register on an investigative target's phone, and then necessarily everyone the target called comes into the toll record, comes into the pen register. That's just how it works. That's what investigations are supposed to do. And if there's proper predication, you then go to the second step to see if there's a basis for investigation of the person at the other end of the call. So let's just understand that we shouldn't be drawing a lot of irate conclusions before we know what the facts are in the context of how such investigations actually work. Here's the second thing, and this goes back to the ranking member's comments about yesterday. To me, yesterday was an awful day in the history of this committee. It set new low after new low after new low. And I'm not going to talk about all of the new lows. I'm going to talk about one in particular. And that is whether anybody noticed the irony that the day before the United States Department of Justice arraigned a former FBI director for allegedly making untruthful statements to this committee, the Attorney General of the United States sat right there and made untruthful statements to this committee. And they weren't maybe untruthful statements. This wasn't a question of nuance. She made allegations about the ranking member and me having received political contributions from some, she said, Epstein close confidant. Well, guess what? That's actually checkable. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission keeps a website that tracks all of our contributions. An intern at the Department of Justice could have checked to see that the allegation, I'll leave it to myself, that I had received campaign contributions from this individual, that was false. And it's not a maybe answer, it's a yes or no. Did I or didn't I? And there's an unimpeachable record that shows that what she said sitting right there was not true. If we are going to care about untruthful statements made by the Department of Justice and the FBI in this committee, let's not have this be yet another area where there are different rules for one party than for the other party. And just by the way, on that very subject, the other thing that the Attorney General did sitting right there was to strip all cover away from the untruthful statements that had been made to this committee by the current FBI director. You all heard him here. He said that he couldn't tell us about his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he first pled the Fifth, then got immunity, and then testified. He couldn't tell us what he testified to, he said, because the Department of Justice had sealed the testimony and because there was a court order barring him from doing that. And he actually identified which judge, the chief judge of the DC Federal District Court. Well, guess what? We know that since then, the chief judge of the Federal District Court has said that that was not true. He said specifically nothing prevented Director Patel from discussing his grand jury testimony. And yesterday, the Attorney General had the chance to say, you're right. We did seal the testimony in that matter. The Department of Justice did seal the testimony, and Patel's statement was true. Not about the court order, but at least it was sealed by the Department of Justice. She didn't say that. So now both his testimony that the DOJ had sealed his testimony and his testimony there was a court order barring his testimony are kind of demonstrably false statements to this committee. And then when he came back and we challenged him on those false statements, his second false statement was to say, I'm not going to answer any of those questions because my transcript of the grand jury testimony, I've worked with the DOJ to see that it is publicly released. Well, it either has been publicly released or it hasn't. It's a very simple distinction, yes or no. And we all know that it has not, in fact, been publicly released. And when we asked about that from the Attorney General, again, she left him high and dry and refused to say that anything had been publicly released, that there was any publicly released transcript. So yesterday stands in really stark contrast. I should say the day before yesterday stands in really stark contrast to yesterday. Yesterday, an FBI director was arraigned for making a false statement. The day before that, the Attorney General of the United States made arguably even falser statements. We'll see how the other case turns out. And she left the current FBI director completely exposed on his multiple false statements that his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case had been sealed by the department, was under court order not to be released, and had since been publicly released as a transcript. I don't know if this committee is going to take itself seriously enough to treat false statements to this committee as serious matters, irrespective of who made them. But the contrast is really stark. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, before you go, I'd like to add, on the first point you made, I'd like to add, not subtract from anything you said, but add to it what I know we're following up on the information that you want us to follow up on. At least you said you wanted us to get the backing of what happened when 8 Republican senators' phone records. I think the FBI is cooperating very well with us. I think we're getting and still going to get more. Then it goes to the Department of Justice. I want the Department of Justice to get over this stuff that's got to go through a dozen levels of review before it ever is given to the Congress of the United States. That's kind of where we are. But I also want to add that what I know is emails show that political bias infected the origins of the investigation. There's no basis to get the toll records from senators. I see it from the emails that I've seen, and I've gotten these from whistleblowers, so they haven't had to go through the bureaucracy I just told about at DOJ. I think it shows that the Arctic Frost was a fishing expedition. I put out enough records to prove that, just for adding to what your concerns are, and I'm not objecting to your legitimacy about the investigation of January 6th. I'm talking about the subpoenaing of 92 Republican or conservative organizations, and then the 8 senators. I think that kind of proves that it's a fishing expedition in addition to the legitimacy of what you said about January 6th. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Imagine my surprise.
At a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing last week, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat Rhode Island, and Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican Iowa, clashed over revelations tied to the so-called Arctic Frost investigation, a controversial FBI probe that has sparked accusations of political bias and improper targeting of lawmakers. Whitehouse began by defending the Justice Department's and FBI's decision to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, rejecting claims that the inquiry was politically weaponized. He reminded colleagues that the violent breach of the Capitol clearly involved criminal acts that required investigation, noting that it is the FBI's job to follow the evidence, regardless of political sensitivities. Turning to reports that senators' phone toll records were swept up in the investigation, Whitehouse explained that such records, modern versions of the old pen registers, only show who called whom and for how long, not the content of any conversations. He stressed that when investigators have legal grounds to monitor one number, calls to or from that number naturally bring other parties' information into the records. That doesn't make them targets, Whitehouse said, warning against dire conclusions before facts are established. He also delivered sharp criticism of the previous day's committee proceedings, calling them a new low. Whitehouse accused Attorney General Merrick Garland of making untruthful statements, when she claimed he and the ranking Republican member had received political donations from an associate of Jeffrey Epstein. The senator said that allegation was demonstrably false and could have been disproven through a simple Federal Election Commission search. Whitehouse further accused FBI Director Kash Patel of giving false testimony to the committee regarding his grand jury appearance in the Mar-a-Lago case. According to Whitehouse, Patel's statements that his testimony had been sealed, restricted by court order, and later released were all untrue. "If we're going to take false statements seriously," Whitehouse said, "there can't be one set of rules for Democrats and another for Republicans." Responding to Whitehouse, Senator Grassley acknowledged the legitimacy of investigating the January 6 attack, but said internal communications provided by whistleblowers suggest that political bias tainted the origins of the Arctic frost operation. He argued that there was no basis to subpoena senators' toll records, and that the probe amounted to a fishing expedition targeting Republican and conservative organizations. Grassley praised the FBI's current cooperation with congressional investigators but criticized the Justice Department's slow document process, saying materials must pass through a dozen levels of review before being released to Congress. He insisted that emails and whistleblower evidence show political bias infected the origins of the investigation. The hearing underscored growing partisan divisions over the Justice Department's conduct and the scope of federal investigations tied to the January 6 insurrection. While Democrats framed Arctic frost as a legitimate inquiry into an unprecedented attack on democracy, Republicans painted it as an example of a politically motivated effort to intimidate critics and opponents of the Biden administration. As both sides called for further scrutiny, the committee appeared united on one point: that the Arctic frost controversy is far from over, and that more revelations are likely to come.